Well, thanks for joining us as we continue through our midweek study. We're in the book of Matthew, chapter 16, and we're going to be starting in verse 13 and going through verse 20. And it's going to be, once again, important to remember the context, what's been happening as we're in this study. So let's go ahead and start reading chapter 16, starting in verse 13, and then we'll bring in some of the contextual issues, and then we'll talk about what's happening in the passage. So it says, "Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Simon Peter replied, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus answered, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you then the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven.' Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ." So the issue here is, this is a very controversial passage from the standpoint of the way that Catholics see this and the way that Protestants see this are very different. Catholics use this passage to develop the idea of Peter being the first pope and an unending line of popes coming from Peter, whereas Protestants view this as something completely different than that. So let's get into this and try to figure out what's going on here, because really this isn't about popes or no popes. This actually has to do with the context of what Jesus has been doing in inaugurating the kingdom. So recall that in chapter 16, Jesus has had these conflicts with the religious leaders. They've tried to put him to the test, and he's called them out for not understanding that he is a sign of the inauguration of the kingdom of God. And then he talked to his own disciples about making sure that the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't intrude or corrupt, didn't create a culture for them that would get in the way of all the recognition and being brought into the kingdom of God as Jesus inaugurates it. So that's the context. Now, what's interesting here is that Peter is now confessing that Jesus is the Christ. And so it seems as if that what Jesus has said to the disciples has been taken to heart, because now you have this confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So when we look at that, it says in verse 15, he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now this is important. This confession is foundational. So that's the issue for Protestants, is Protestants see this confession as the rock upon which Jesus is going to build his church, whereas Catholics see the person of Peter as the rock upon which Jesus will build his church. Now, here's the thing that's important for us, is that we can look at this and see that there's actually more going on. So they get to the region of Caesarea Philippi, and he says, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" So he's basically saying, what are people saying about me? They know that he's talking about Jesus. Jesus is talking about himself. They know that, even though he says, he refers to himself as the Son of Man. Now, the first question is, why does Jesus refer to himself as the Son of Man? Well, it goes all the way back to this issue of Adam being the first man, and as first man, Adam is covenant head. Now, this is a way of thinking that's kind of foreign to us. We talked about bread and the idea of a loaf of bread, and that there's a unity there that's made up of individual grains, just as a group of people is made up of individual people. This idea of the unity of groups is very, very important in the ancient mindset. They were very much more aware of the idea of relationship and the importance of groups. So we have a tendency to take this for granted. when you ask people about, what it means to be part of the United States, what it means to be a part of the state of Arizona, what it means to be a part of Maricopa County or Phoenix or Tempe or whatever, these things for us are kind of irrelevant in a way. We travel through the United States. We live in different states. Now people will live in different parts of the world, and we don't see that as a big deal. There's people who will go off and live, in Eastern Europe for a couple of years because they can work remotely, and they'll go live somewhere else for a couple of years. And then, we see ourselves kinds of as citizens of the world in a lot of ways. And even if you don't see yourself as a citizen of the world, I've lived in Colorado, I've lived in Michigan, I've lived in California, I've lived in Missouri. I didn't think, I'm a Missourian now, and that's super important to me. We don't see these as part of our identities. That's not the way that it worked in the ancient world. These identities were incredibly important, and really your survival depended upon these identities. You needed to be part of a group, and there was an interesting way of dealing with people that were outside of the group. You see, loyalty and ethical treatment were very important inside of the group, but they weren't as important outside of the group. And so you needed to find yourself in a group. It was very important. On your own, you stood very little chance. You needed to be part of a group, and you needed to make sure that your place in that group was secure. That's kind of the way that the world was in their eyes. Now, all right, so these group identities are really important, and Jesus, referring to himself as the Son of Man, is actually talking about the group identity of humans, and he's talking about what it means to be covenant head of this group. So the idea here is important, that a covenant head represents the group. Now, we understand this even though we don't really know that we understand this. We elect a president, and we understand that president represents us to the world. And the actions that he takes represent who we are. So as an example, in World War II, when the Japanese attacked us, we didn't see that 300 or 400 pilots from Japan attacked us, and we didn't kind of want to track them down and arrest them. We saw that the covenant head of Japan had attacked us, and because that's the case, all of Japan had attacked us, because what he does represents everybody. And so the point here is that when Jesus identifies himself as Son of Man, he's going all the way back. In fact, we can turn in our Bibles all the way back to Genesis. And if we go back to Genesis, what we see is that Adam, being the first man, he represented everybody. And the problem is that when Adam represented everybody, he represented us into sin. And that's a problem. So what do we make of then if Adam has sinned, and in him all of us have sinned, and the Bible's very clear that that's the case? How do we get out of this problem? Well, it's contained actually in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. So God, in this part of the chapter 3 of Genesis, is going over the curses, what's going to happen because Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. In talking to the serpent, that starts in verse 14, it says, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life." And then in verse 15 it says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So the idea here is that God is revealing that there's going to be an offspring, and that offspring is going to crush the head of the serpent. So basically, Satan's downfall is going to come from this offspring. And so Jesus is the Son of Man. He is the offspring that is promised. And He's the son of mankind. He's the next Adam. He's the one who's going to be the new representative, the new covenant head. So the interesting thing is when he says, who do people say that the Son of Man is? They don't respond by going, oh, well, what do you mean? Who's the Son of Man? They understand that he's referring to himself. And then they answer, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So basically people's opinions are, well, this has got to be a prophet. Now, the interesting thing is the prophets actually point to Jesus. The prophets are precursors, they're forerunners. The best example of that is John the Baptist. John the Baptist came to prepare the way for Jesus. He came to prepare the way for the person who was going to inaugurate the kingdom. He came to prepare the way for the person who was going to crush the head of Satan. He was not the person who was going to crush the head of Satan. He came to prepare the way for that. And really, to a large extent, all of the prophets kind of did something similar. Now, that's what people are saying. He's another prophet in this line of prophets who are pointing to the Messiah, the Christ, the one who's going to be the one. But Jesus, in verse 15 of chapter 16 of Matthew, says, no, I'm going to get more specific here. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Now, the interesting thing is he's pointing this to all of them, because he said to them, not he said to him, he said to them. So he's saying to the disciples, all of them, who do you say that I am? Now, it's not surprising to us that Simon Peter is the one who speaks up. He's always the one who's kind of jumping in. Now, the funny thing here is that generally when Simon Peter jumps in, it's kind of doesn't have the best results ever. But here, he knocks it out of the park. Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. So he's blessed. Why? Well, because if Jesus is the one inaugurating the kingdom, then belief in Jesus is vital to entering the kingdom. How could it be any other way? Let's say you're in a country and more than one person claims to be president. So if any of you have been watching the news this week, South Africa has been going through this. They had a president that basically tried to stage a coup against the next president coming in. And there are some people who support the outgoing president who has been jailed, and there's people who support the new president, and there's a massive conflict going on. Now, the thing is, the question is who, if you're in South Africa, the question for you is, who do you believe the president is? And that has everything to do with what kingdom you're in and what your future is going to be. If you pick the old president, that's going to lead you in a direction. If you pick the new president, that's going to lead you in a direction. All of your future kind of resides in who do you believe is the real president. And this has occurred over and over again in history, where people will see a new government as the one that's in power. Some will see the old government, and how you see the world, how you see news, how you see your neighbors, how you see everything, the way that you experience life, and ultimately your future has to do with who do you say is the rightful leader. It's the same way. How can it be any different here with Jesus? Either Jesus is the new covenant head or he's not. And if he is the new covenant head, then by believing in him, having confidence in him, having trust in him, by submitting to him, by accepting him as the covenant head, you are now part of his kingdom. Whereas if you believe that he's not, then you're still under the old kingdom. Now, clearly, as Protestant, I see that there's a lot more weight or evidence to be put behind the confession of Peter as the rock that Jesus is going to build his church on than the fact that it's Peter himself as a person. However, one of the other options here is that Jesus here is at Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus here is, there are some people who argue that what's happening here has to do with the mountain that Jesus is near and what he's pointing to and what he says, this mountain. that what Jesus is really doing is pointing to a place that was a renowned place of evil in the world, and Jesus is saying that on this mountain that he's going to build his kingdom, and the gates of hell is not going to prevail against it. And it ties together this idea of the gates of hell with the location where he's at, because where he's at is a place that was kind of considered the gates of hell. And the argument is that what Jesus here is saying is that I'm going to establish my kingdom right here in the heart of enemy territory, and nobody's going to be able to stop me. The gates of hell are not going to be able to prevail against the church. The church is breaking in to enemy-held territory, and the defenses of this enemy-held territory don't stand a chance against me. Now, I think that there's probably a lot to be said for that as well. I think that those two things go hand in hand. The idea of Peter's confession and the idea of enemy territory, I think those things go hand in hand, because ultimately what takes the territory and what can be completely unstoppable to the world is the Spirit of God moving in people and showing them that Jesus is the Messiah. The gates of hell have no ability to withstand that. And that actually is shown throughout the history of Christianity, because Christianity starts here in this very small backwater of a place and spreads throughout the world, and it's been unstoppable. So I think that there is some great things for us to see in this passage and some great things for us to learn. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you guys next week.